In 1990, life in the small Virginia town of Ashford moved at an unhurried pace. Neighbors waved to each other from porches, children rode bicycles on quiet streets, and people assumed they knew the families who lived around them. It was the kind of town where doors were left unlocked and gossip carried faster than the evening breeze. Yet within this ordinary landscape, one family concealed a secret so shocking that when it surfaced, it would forever shatter the town's trust in appearances. The Beckham family lived in a weather-worn house at the edge of town, tucked behind overgrown hedges and a sagging wooden fence. To most, they were simply reclusive. Mr. Beckham worked irregular jobs, sometimes hauling scrap metal, other times fixing engines for cash. Mrs. Beckham was rarely seen, her face pale and withdrawn during her occasional trips to the grocery store. Their young son was almost never spotted. Some neighbors claimed to have caught glimpses of a boy in the backyard, but always fleeting, always silent. At first, nobody thought much of it. Families kept to themselves, privacy was respected. Yet as months turned into years, whispers began to grow. Why was the Beckham boy not at school? Why did he never play with other children? And why did the parents never invite anyone into their home? Still, the questions floated unanswered. People told themselves stories to explain away the strangeness. Maybe the boy was sick. Maybe he was homeschooled. Maybe the family just preferred solitude. In communities where politeness often outweighed curiosity, suspicion rarely grew into action. And so the Beckham home remained a place of mystery, hidden in plain sight. Behind those closed doors, however, a much darker reality unfolded. The Beckhams did not simply live apart from the community, they lived against it. Their distrust of the outside world ran deep, and they carried a warped belief that their child should not be raised as other children were. Instead of nurturing him, they confined him, both physically and emotionally, in ways that stripped him of dignity. Visitors were never allowed inside. When relatives came, they were turned away at the door with excuses. Teachers never saw enrollment papers. Doctors were never called. The Beckham boy lived like a shadow, his existence acknowledged only in passing, never embraced. Yet the strangest detail, the one that unsettled the rare neighbor who lingered by the fence long enough, was the sound. At night, barking echoed faintly from the yard. It wasn't the deep growl of a hound or the high yips of a terrier. It was off, almost human, but people dismissed it. Must be a dog, they said, shrugging off the unease that crept into their chests. After all, who would imagine a child making such noises? This is where the tragedy deepens, not just in the cruelty of the parents, but in the silence of the community. The warning signs were there: a child unseen, a family withdrawn, sounds that didn't quite make sense. But people rationalized and excused what they observed. Some were afraid of offending the Beckhams. Others believed it wasn't their business. A few muttered to themselves, "It's not my place to interfere in how someone raises their child." And so the cycle of neglect stretched on, protected by indifference and the polite distance of neighbors. It is uncomfortable to admit, but true evil often hides not because it is invisible, but because people choose not to look closely enough. The Beckham family relied on this silence, using isolation as a shield while their son's childhood slipped away unnoticed. By late 1990, however, the facade of normalcy began to crack. An anonymous caller contacted local social services, claiming something was wrong at the Beckham home. The caller described hearing noises, seeing a boy crawling in the yard, and fearing that he was not being cared for properly. It was the first time someone had broken the silence. When the social worker arrived, she was struck immediately by the condition of the property. The house sagged, the windows were covered with heavy curtains, and the backyard was littered with rusted metal and old car parts. But it was the shed behind the house that drew her attention. A faint whimpering sound seeped from inside, followed by a noise that was neither fully human nor fully animal. Her knock on the door was met with hesitation. Mrs. Beckham appeared, nervous and defensive. "We don't need help," she insisted, trying to turn the worker away. But the social worker persisted, demanding entry. And when she finally opened that shed door, the truth spilled into daylight. What she found inside was almost beyond comprehension: a boy, frail and dirty, crawling on all fours, a metal chain fastened around his ankle. His hands and knees were calloused from years of crawling on the ground. He did not look up immediately. He was conditioned to keep his head low. A dog bowl lay nearby, half filled with scraps. The shock of the discovery reverberated through the town. People who had passed the Beckham house daily were suddenly forced to confront the horror they had ignored. The family they thought was simply private had been hiding abuse of the most dehumanizing kind. The boy, hidden in plain sight, had lived less as a child and more as a captive. The story of the Beckhams in 1990 is more than just a disturbing headline. It is a mirror held up to every community that hesitates to act when something feels wrong. It teaches a sobering truth: cruelty does not always wear a mask of violence. It often disguises itself in silence, privacy, and neglect. Yet within that same truth lies hope. It only took one voice, one phone call, to break the cycle. The anonymous caller who dared to speak up became the turning point in the boy's life. That act of courage reminds us that vigilance is not meddling, it is protection. Compassion is not interference, it is responsibility. The Beckham case, shocking as it was, still carries a lesson that endures. We are all responsible for the children we see, even when they are not our own. Childhood is meant to be a time of innocence, of scraped knees from play, of bedtime stories, of warm embraces from parents who promise safety. But for the Beckham boy in 1990, Virginia, childhood was not a sanctuary, it was a sentence. While other children learned to write their names and chased fireflies in the summer air, he lived in a world defined by chains, a dog bowl, and the constant reminder that he was not treated as human. Each morning, if one could call it morning, the boy awoke on a tattered blanket inside a dim shed behind the Beckham house. The shed smelled of damp wood, mold, and rusted metal. His small body curled against the cold. He would wait until one of his parents opened the door, often tossing scraps of food into the bowl beside him. The bowl was not his choice, it was his only option. He was expected to crawl to it on hands and knees, lapping at its contents as though his humanity were a luxury he did not deserve. The chain around his ankle was short enough to restrict his movements, but long enough to force him to crawl. The calluses on his palms and knees thickened over time, a grotesque evidence of his forced life on all fours. His parents insisted he bark for attention rather than speak. If he attempted words, he was silenced with harshness. Over months, then years, his voice faltered, language withered where it should have flourished. The cruelty was not only physical but psychological. The boy was isolated, denied interaction with other children or caring adults. He could hear faint echoes of laughter from the street beyond the fence, but those sounds belonged to a world he was not allowed to touch. Inside his cage of neglect, days blurred together. He did not know birthdays or holidays, had no concept of a classroom, no knowledge of playground friendships. His toys were scraps of wood or metal left on the shed floor. His imagination became his only escape, weaving silent stories in his mind as he curled against the wall, dreaming of a life he barely believed existed. The silence pressed down heavier than the chain. No one read him stories. No one tucked him in. No one spoke to him as a child, only as a burden or an animal. And so, he grew quieter, shrinking into the role forced upon him. Language is a child's bridge to the world, but for the Beckham boy, that bridge was deliberately burned. By being made to bark, crawl, and eat like an animal, he was robbed of his most basic identity. Words like mom, dad, or friend never found a place in his daily vocabulary. It wasn't that he could not think or understand. His mind was alive, yearning, curious, but without the opportunity to learn or practice, expression withered. His silence was not proof of inability, but of stolen opportunity. This detail became crucial later in therapy. The boy would eventually prove that he was not incapable, only denied the chance to grow. His story stands as a chilling reminder of what neglect can strip away, and a hopeful testament to what the human spirit can reclaim. Food was scarce, and never offered with dignity. Scraps from his parents' meals were dumped into his bowl, often cold, often spoiled. He learned quickly not to complain. Hunger became his companion, gnawing at him until he accepted whatever was thrown his way. Fear, too, became routine. Fear of punishment if he tried to stand upright. Fear of rejection if he spoke. Fear of abandonment if he hoped too much. Children should live with fears of scraped knees or bedtime monsters, not the fear of existing wrongly. But for the Beckham boy, fear was constant, shaping his every movement and thought. Though the physical conditions were cruel, the hidden wounds ran deeper. To be denied love is to be denied identity. The boy was not just chained physically. He was chained emotionally to the belief that he was unworthy of care. His parents' neglect was not simply abuse, it was a declaration that he did not matter. And yet, even in such darkness, sparks of resilience flickered. Sometimes at night, he would hum to himself, tuneless, broken, but a sound that reminded him he was alive. Sometimes he would trace shapes into the dirt floor, creating a world only he could see. These small acts of resistance, invisible to anyone else, were proof that the child within him had not been completely extinguished. The Beckham boy's suffering forces us to confront a painful truth: neglect and abuse rarely happen in isolation. They are shielded by silence, by neighbors who look away, by systems too slow to intervene. His chains were physical, but they were also forged by community indifference. How many people had walked past the Beckham home, noticing something strange but saying nothing? How many chances were missed to free him sooner? His stolen childhood is a lesson written in pain. The cost of inaction is measured in the scars of the innocent. And yet, perhaps the most extraordinary part of his story is that his spirit did not break. Yes, he was malnourished. Yes, his language delayed. Yes, his body bore marks of crawling where he should have been running. But when he was finally freed, social workers noticed something striking in his eyes, a hunger not just for food, but for connection. The chain could confine his body, but it could not fully cage his spirit. The boy still longed for kindness, still reached out when someone offered a gentle hand. That longing was proof of something unbreakable within him, the natural human desire for love and belonging. The Beckham case is disturbing because it strips away illusions. It shows what happens when care is withheld, when love is denied, when cruelty replaces nurture. But it also shows the resilience of the human spirit. The lesson is clear: no child should be invisible. When we ignore signs, when we excuse strangeness, when we silence our suspicions, we allow chains like these to tighten. But when one person speaks up, when one person acts, the chains can be broken. The Beckham boy's childhood in chains is not just his story. It is a mirror for us all. It asks, will you look away, or will you act when you see a child in need? In the autumn of 1990, a single phone call changed everything. It was anonymous, whispered by someone who had grown uneasy with the Beckham family for months. The caller spoke of strange sounds, barking that seemed more human than animal, and of a child seen crawling in the backyard. The words were enough to rouse Virginia's Child Protective Services into action. Though many reports turn out to be misunderstandings, this one carried an urgency that could not be ignored. On a gray morning, social worker Denise Holloway drove her government-issued sedan down the narrow road that led to the Beckham home. She had visited countless families in crisis, but something about this case unsettled her. The house stood at the far edge of town, half hidden by a thicket of trees, its roof sagging and windows sealed with heavy curtains. To Denise, it did not look like a home at all. It looked like a warning. When she knocked on the front door, Mrs. Beckham appeared, her face pale and nervous. She blocked the doorway, insisting there was no child living there, that the neighbors were mistaken. Denise had heard such denials before. Calmly but firmly she pressed, explaining she had the authority to see the child if one was present. Reluctantly, Mrs. Beckham stepped aside, muttering excuses about privacy and misunderstanding. Inside, the house was bare and cold. The air smelled of mildew and grease. There were no toys, no school books, no signs of a child's presence. Denise's unease deepened. She asked where the boy was. The parents shifted uncomfortably before admitting he was back. As Denise stepped into the backyard, her heart clenched. Against the backdrop of rusted car parts and tangled weeds stood a small wooden shed. From inside came a sound, soft, broken, neither fully bark nor fully cry. It was a sound no mother, no father, no human should ever hear from a child. Denise approached slowly, her hand trembling as she gripped the handle. She called out, gently at first, "Hello, is someone in there?" The noises stopped, replaced by silence so heavy it made her chest ache. Then came a whimper, unmistakably human. She pulled the door open. What she saw inside left her breathless. A boy, thin and filthy, crouched on all fours in the corner. A chain clinked at his ankle, fastened to a metal ring in the wall. His clothes were little more than rags. A battered dog bowl sat near him, its contents half spilled onto the floor. At first, the boy did not look up. His eyes stayed fixed on the ground, trained by years of fear to avoid human contact. When Denise stepped closer, he let out a sound. A bark, strained and hollow. It was the only language he had been allowed to use. Denise knelt, tears stinging her eyes.
"It's okay,"
she whispered. "You're safe now." She extended her hand, palm open, not to force but to offer. Slowly, cautiously, the boy lifted his gaze. His eyes, wide and dark, reflected hunger and fear, but also a flicker of something else, hope. Denise wasted no time. She radioed for police backup and medical assistance. Within the hour, flashing lights pierced the quiet Virginia road, drawing curious neighbors from their porches. Officers led the Beckhams out in handcuffs, while paramedics rushed to examine the boy. He resisted at first, recoiling from their touch, unused to gentleness, but hunger eventually overcame fear. Wrapped in a blanket, he allowed himself to be carried into the ambulance. For the first time, he was leaving the prison that had defined his childhood. The neighborhood, once silent, now buzzed with disbelief. People who had passed by the Beckham home for years stood stunned. Some wept openly, others shook their heads, unable to comprehend how such cruelty had gone unnoticed for so long. At the hospital, doctors confirmed the boy was malnourished, underweight, and developmentally delayed from years of neglect. His knees and hands bore thick calluses from crawling. His vocal cords, strained by years of barking, made speech difficult. Yet physically he was alive, and with care he could recover. His first meal in the hospital was simple, warm soup, bread, and juice. Unlike the scraps thrown at him before, this food was offered with kindness, served on a tray with utensils. At first he crouched instinctively, attempting to eat with his hands. A nurse gently guided him, showing him how to use a spoon. It was awkward, messy, but it was the beginning of reclaiming his humanity. That night, tucked into a clean bed with fresh sheets, he lay awake for hours. The silence was strange, no chains rattling, no parents shouting. For the first time, he closed his eyes knowing someone was watching over him, not to harm him but to keep him safe. Meanwhile, the Beckham parents faced charges of severe neglect and abuse. Their explanations shocked the courtroom. They claimed they had been teaching discipline, that the boy was different and needed to be trained. Their warped justifications did nothing to lessen their guilt. The judge condemned their actions as dehumanizing, sentencing them to years in prison. The trial became a symbol across Virginia, a grim reminder of the dangers of unchecked isolation and the necessity of community vigilance. For the boy, the discovery was both an ending and a beginning. The life of chains was over, but the journey to healing had only just begun. Every step forward, learning to speak, to walk upright confidently, to trust, would take patience and time. But unlike before, he would not walk that road alone. Social workers, foster parents, and therapists would stand beside him, helping him rebuild the life he had been denied. And through it all, one truth shone clear: he had been found. He was no longer hidden. He was no longer a secret in a shed. The Beckham rescue taught a hard but vital lesson. One anonymous call, one persistent social worker, one act of courage. That was all it took to break the silence and save a life. It reminds us that rescue does not always come in grand gestures. Sometimes it comes in the form of noticing, questioning, refusing to look away. Sometimes it is as simple as dialing a phone. The boy's story urges us to be vigilant, to speak when something feels wrong, to protect the voiceless. Because behind every closed door could be a child waiting for rescue, waiting for someone to choose compassion over silence. Rescue was not the end of the Beckham boy's story. It was only the first step on a long and uncertain road. Chains could be cut in a single day, but the invisible chains of trauma, those wrapped around his mind and heart, would take years to loosen. Healing, for him, was not a moment but a journey, marked by setbacks, small triumphs, and the unwavering patience of those who refused to give up on him. In the days after his rescue, Hospital staff worked tirelessly to stabilize him. Physically, his body was frail but not beyond repair. He gained weight quickly once fed properly, and his wounds, both external and internal, were treated with care. Yet the psychological damage was harder to reach. At night, he woke up crying, sometimes barking in panic, reverting to the only behavior he had known to survive. Nurses reassured him softly, holding his hand, reminding him he no longer needed to crawl, that he was safe. But his mind had been conditioned for so long that fear clung to him like a shadow. Even simple things frightened him, the sound of doors shutting, sudden voices, the feeling of being watched. To most children, these were ordinary events. To him, they were echoes of punishment. His recovery would require more than medicine. It required rebuilding his understanding of what it meant to be human. When he entered foster care, his new parents faced a daunting challenge. He was not like other children his age. At 8 years old, he did not know how to play catch, how to hold a pencil, or how to greet someone with words. His instincts told him to crawl rather than walk, to hide rather than explore, to bark rather than speak. The first toy he was given, a stuffed bear, was met with confusion. He turned it over in his hands as if searching for instructions. Slowly, he began to understand it was his, something soft and comforting, not another reminder of shame. His foster mother later said the moment he clutched the bear to his chest and fell asleep was when she knew healing had begun. Learning to be a child again was not easy. He had to be taught how to eat at a table, how to use utensils, how to speak in sentences. Words were difficult, but with therapy, his voice grew stronger. His first clear sentence, "I'm not a dog," brought his foster family to tears. Therapists worked closely with him, addressing the trauma that shaped his earliest years. They used play therapy, picture cards, and gentle repetition to teach him how to communicate and express feelings. At first, he resisted. Years of neglect had convinced him that showing emotions led to punishment. But slowly he learned that anger, sadness, and joy could be shared safely. Trust was the hardest lesson. He struggled to believe that kindness would last. If a foster parent left the room, he panicked, fearing abandonment. If someone raised their voice, he recoiled, expecting cruelty. Each moment of reassurance, however, built a new foundation. Every time a caregiver returned, every time a promise was kept, every time patience replaced punishment, trust grew stronger. Healing was not a straight line. There were setbacks. He sometimes lashed out in frustration, unable to find words for the storms inside him. At school, he felt different from other children, embarrassed by his delays. Bullying made him retreat, questioning if he truly belonged. But his teachers, aware of his past, nurtured his strengths instead of dwelling on his weaknesses. They celebrated every milestone, his first essay, his first time reading aloud, his first participation in class. What others might have dismissed as small victories were, for him, monumental. One of the turning points came when he discovered storytelling. In therapy, he was encouraged to draw pictures of his feelings. Those pictures became stories, simple at first, but gradually more complex. He wrote about heroes breaking free from cages, about children finding homes, about dogs who became human again. Through these stories, he reclaimed the language stolen from him. Writing gave him control over his narrative. It allowed him to shape his pain into purpose. He was no longer voiceless. He was a survivor with something to say. The road to healing was paved with compassion. Compassion from doctors who treated his wounds, from foster parents who embraced his fears, from teachers who saw potential rather than deficiency. Each act of kindness chipped away at the walls built by years of neglect. His foster mother recalled a moment when he asked, hesitantly, "Do you love me?" She pulled him into her arms and whispered, "Yes, always." It was the first time in his memory anyone had said those words to him. That moment became a turning point. He began to believe he was worthy of love. By his teenage years, he was unrecognizable compared to the frail boy found in the shed. He walked tall, spoke with confidence, and dreamed of becoming a counselor for children who suffered as he had. Those scars remained. Nightmares, moments of self-doubt, lingering questions about why his parents had failed him. He refused to let his past define his future. Healing had not erased the pain, but it had given it meaning. His resilience became an example not only to other survivors, but to the entire community that once overlooked him. The Beckham boys' long road to healing is not only a story of survival, but of transformation. It teaches us that no wound is too deep when met with patience, love, and compassion. It reminds us that children are not shaped solely by what they suffer, but by how others choose to respond afterward. Most of all, it reveals the power of human resilience. Though he was raised in chains, he broke free, not just physically but spiritually. He proved that even in the darkest conditions, the spark of humanity can endure, waiting for the chance to grow. The Beckham family's disturbing case did not end with the boys' rescue. It rippled outward like a stone dropped into water, forcing neighbors, social workers, lawmakers, and ordinary citizens to face uncomfortable truths. It was not only the story of one boy's suffering, but also a mirror held up to society, asking how did this happen in plain sight? The answers, and the lessons drawn from them, remain vital even today. Perhaps the most shocking aspect of the Beckham case was how long it remained hidden. The boy had been raised in chains, treated like an animal for years. Yet the family lived in a neighborhood, not in complete isolation. Neighbors passed the home daily. Some heard barking, others noticed odd behavior, but few acted. This raised a painful question: how often do we ignore warning signs because we fear being wrong, or because we think it's not our business? The Beckham case showed that silence can be as dangerous as cruelty. It demonstrated that abuse can hide behind closed doors, but also behind the comfort of our assumptions that it couldn't happen here. The first lesson, then, was vigilance. Communities must train themselves to notice, to question, and to care enough to act. The turning point in the Beckham story came from one anonymous call. A single person, perhaps a neighbor who had been silent for too long, chose to speak. That act of courage saved a boy's life. From this, society learned the second lesson: reporting matters. One voice, one phone call, one decision to speak instead of staying quiet can mean the difference between life and death, between captivity and freedom. Too often, people hesitate, worried about false alarms or offending others. Yet in child protection, it is better to be mistaken than to allow harm to continue. The Beckham case drove home the importance of child abuse hotlines, of making reporting easy and accessible, and of educating the public that if something feels wrong, it is worth speaking up. The case also revealed cracks in the system. Virginia's Child Protective Services had been stretched thin in the 1990s, burdened with too many cases and too few resources. Social workers were often overworked, juggling dozens of families at once. In such an environment, children like the Beckham boy could slip through unnoticed. The lesson here was institutional. Protecting children requires investment. It demands properly funded social services, well-trained staff, and systems that prioritize safety above bureaucracy. After the Beckham case, debates arose about increasing budgets for child welfare, improving cross-agency communication, and creating stronger checks to ensure no report went uninvestigated. It became clear that while individual compassion saves lives, systemic support ensures those rescues are not rare exceptions. Another key lesson was the role of education, not only for professionals, but for the public. Teachers, doctors, clergy, and even neighbors are often the first to notice signs of abuse. Yet without training, many miss the red flags or doubt themselves. In the wake of the Beckham case, schools in parts of Virginia began offering workshops on recognizing abuse. Medical staff were reminded to look beyond physical injuries and notice behavioral signs: fear, malnourishment, delayed speech, and unusual behaviors. The community learned that everyone has a role to play. Protecting children cannot be left to social workers alone. It is a responsibility shared by all. Perhaps the most profound lesson was moral. The Beckham parents justified their cruelty by saying they were disciplining their son, training him because he was different. In their twisted minds, they stripped him of his humanity. They reduced a child to the level of an animal. Society had to reckon with the dangers of dehumanization. When we begin to see others, especially children, the vulnerable or the marginalized, as less than human, abuse becomes easier to justify. The Beckham case reminded us that every child, regardless of behavior or difference, is worthy of dignity, care, and love. The Beckham boy's suffering could not be undone, but his story became a rallying cry for prevention. Advocacy groups used the case to push for stronger child protection laws. Legislators debated harsher penalties for neglect and better safeguards for at-risk children. Churches, schools, and community centers held forums, urging families to be more attentive to the children around them. Media outlets covered the story widely, using its horror to raise awareness. Though painful, the case awakened society to the reality that abuse is not an abstract issue. It happens here now, and it demands response. Beyond vigilance and policy, the Beckham case carried a simpler, deeper lesson: the need for compassion. The boy's life was saved not by systems alone, but by individuals who chose to care. The neighbor who called, the social worker who persisted, the nurse who sat with him through his nightmares, the foster mother who told him he was loved. It showed that healing requires not only justice but kindness. Society learned that while laws can punish, only compassion can restore. Today, the Beckham case is remembered not just as a tragedy but as a turning point. It became a story told in classrooms, social work trainings, and advocacy campaigns. Survivors of abuse found strength in it, recognizing that they were not alone and that recovery was possible. The enduring lesson is that no community can afford complacency. Protecting children requires vigilance, courage, education, strong systems, and above all, humanity. The Beckham boy's suffering reminds us what is at stake. His rescue reminds us of what is possible when even one person chooses to act. The case leaves us with this truth: society is only as strong as the care it shows for its most vulnerable. The measure of a community is not in its wealth or achievements, but in how it safeguards those without power or voice. The Beckham family's cruelty will never be forgotten, but neither will the courage of those who broke the silence, the resilience of the boy who survived, and the lessons that now guide us to be better guardians of the next generation. When the boy from the Beckham case was first carried out of that shed in 1990, few believed he would recover. Years of neglect had robbed him of language, education, and even the basic habits of being human. He had lived as a prisoner of cruelty, reduced to crawling, barking, and surviving on scraps. And yet, as the years unfolded, something extraordinary emerged. The boy did not just heal, he grew into a young man who embodied resilience. His story, once defined by chains and silence, became a testament to the unbreakable strength of the human spirit. In the early days after his rescue, survival was the only goal. He had to eat, gain weight, sleep without fear, and relearn the simplest of actions: walking upright, holding a pencil, stringing words into sentences. Each milestone was small but monumental. What struck his foster parents and therapists most was not just his progress, but his determination. Though he often cried in frustration, he never stopped trying. He stumbled when learning to run, but stood up again. He spoke haltingly, but kept practicing. His resilience was quiet, patient, and stubborn. It was as if a part of him had always known he was more than what his parents made him believe. Perhaps the greatest victory of resilience was his choice to trust. After years of betrayal by those meant to protect him, he had every reason to close himself off. Instead, slowly, he allowed others into his world. He learned that a raised voice was not always followed by pain, that hands reaching toward him could offer comfort, not chains. That words like, "I love you," could be true, not traps. This ability to open himself to love again revealed resilience at its deepest level. It was not simply about enduring hardship, but about refusing to let hardship define his heart. When he entered school, he was years behind his peers, yet he refused to remain there. With tutors, patient teachers, and hours of effort, he caught up. Reading became his escape, writing his therapy. One of his essays, written in high school, began with the words, "I was once treated like a dog, now I write like a man." That sentence, raw and defiant, captured the essence of his resilience. Education gave him a weapon against the darkness of his past. It gave him a way to speak, to be heard, and to prove, to himself and to the world, that his identity was not limited to what had been done to him. Resilience often transforms wounds into wisdom. For the Beckham boy, this transformation became his mission. As a teenager, he began speaking at small community gatherings about child protection. Nervous at first, his voice shook as he told his story. But the more he spoke, the more people listened. Parents wept. Teachers nodded with renewed resolve. Children who had suffered in silence found courage to come forward. His survival was no longer just his own. It became a light for others lost in darkness. By sharing his journey, he turned personal suffering into collective strength. His resilience became contagious, reminding others that healing is possible, no matter how broken the past. Therapists who worked with him often reflected that his progress demonstrated what research later confirmed. Resilience is not something only a few are born with. It can be nurtured through love, stability, and belief. Every moment of patience from his foster mother, every encouraging word from a teacher, every small success reinforced his ability to bounce back. His story became living proof that resilience is a partnership between inner will and outer support. Without one, survival is difficult. With both, transformation is possible. Even as he built a new life, memories of the shed lingered. Nightmares haunted him. Triggers, a barking dog, a locked door, sometimes pulled him back into fear. But resilience does not mean forgetting, it means facing the past without being destroyed by it. Through therapy, he learned to confront those memories. He stopped asking, "Why me?" and began asking, "What now?" He refused to let his parents' cruelty define his future. Instead, he used the pain as fuel, to advocate, to connect, to live more fully. This shift from victim to survivor was the essence of his resilience. By adulthood, his story had spread beyond Virginia. He was invited to speak at universities, child welfare conferences, and advocacy events. Each time, he stood tall, not as a symbol of tragedy, but as a voice of triumph. Other survivors looked to him and saw possibility. Communities looked to him and saw responsibility. Policymakers looked to him and saw urgency. His resilience had become a force larger than himself. It was shaping the world around him. The Beckham case remains one of the most disturbing child neglect stories in modern memory. But what outlives the horror is the boy's resilience. His journey teaches us that resilience is not perfection, nor is it the absence of pain. It is the refusal to surrender, the daily choice to rise, the courage to love again when betrayal made that seem impossible. For society, his resilience carries a challenge: to never underestimate the power of compassion in helping others rise. For individuals, it carries hope. No matter the depth of suffering, there is strength within to overcome. The boy who was once chained in a shed, treated as less than human, grew into a man who proved the exact opposite, that the human spirit is unbreakable. His life became the final testimony in the Beckham case, not of cruelty, but of resilience. And so the lesson stands: while cruelty can wound deeply, resilience can heal stronger. The power of human resilience is not in denying the darkness, but in showing that even from the darkest place, light can emerge.